She entered the presidential suite by mistake, a ghost seeking refuge in a world not her own. But the stranger waiting in the shadows was no ordinary man. He was the tycoon, a powerful billionaire who owned the city that glittered outside her window. He watched her with the stillness of a predator, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a silken trap. He didn't ask who she was. He told her she wouldn't leave. Not until she understood how a key to a simple room had opened the door to her perfectly sealed world. Subscribe and stay until the end. Tell me in the comments, which city are you watching this story from? The keycard slid into the lock with a soft green click, a sound that promised refuge. Amber Olsen leaned her forehead against the heavy wood of the door, the weight of a life she'd just dismantled, pressing down on her shoulders. All she wanted was silence. The clean, quiet anonymity only a hotel room could offer. A single night to breathe before facing the wreckage of her future. The door was heavier than it should have been, swinging inward with a hushed, expensive sigh that was the first sign something was wrong. She stepped inside, expecting a small, perfectly ordinary room. Instead, she walked into an expanse of impossible space. A wall of glass stood where a wall of plaster should have been, and beyond it, the city glittered like a fallen constellation. The silence inside was different, not empty but filled with a waiting stillness. Her breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be right. Her tired mind fumbled for an explanation. A lucky mistake, then. An upgrade she didn't ask for but wouldn't dare question. Letting her bag slip from her shoulder, she drifted deeper into the suite, her fingers trailing over the cool marble of a console table. The air tasted of money, not the stale scent of old paper, but something alive and sharp. Expensive cologne, rain, and the faint, biting aroma of whiskey. Her pulse gave a nervous flutter. The room wasn't just empty. It felt recently occupied. On a low table near the window, a heavy crystal tumbler sat, a single melting ice cube swimming in a pool of amber liquid. Panic, cold and swift, replaced her wonder. This wasn't an upgrade. It was a mistake. A terrible, mortifying mistake. She was an intruder. As she turned to flee, a sound stopped her cold, freezing the blood in her veins. A soft, deliberate clink. The sound of ice hitting glass, coming from the deep shadows near the balcony. Then a voice. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, low and smooth, cutting through the silence like velvet-wrapped steel. "You're not leaving." The words were not a shout, not a threat, but a statement of fact, delivered with a finality that slammed an invisible door between Amber and the outside world. Her blood ran cold, then immediately hot with a fresh surge of adrenaline. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to turn, to bolt, to ignore the impossible command. But she was frozen, held captive by the sheer unwavering certainty in his tone. This was a man who did not make suggestions. He shaped reality with his voice. Slowly, as if emerging from the very shadows he inhabited, he moved. He didn't walk. He flowed. Like smoke given form, he moved from the deep darkness of the balcony into the soft, ambient light of the suite, and her world tilted on its axis. He was a paradox of raw power and refined elegance. A dark grey cashmere sweater clung to a frame that was all lean muscle and broad shoulders, the soft, expensive fabric doing little to gentle the predatory stillness in his posture. Dark trousers were tailored with a precision that spoke of a fortune spent on appearing effortless. He moved with a liquid grace, each step silent on the plush, cream-colored carpet, his presence so commanding that it seemed to draw all the air in the cavernous room toward him, leaving none for her to breathe. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic wild bird trying to escape its cage. Her eyes were wide, taking in the details of the man who now stood between her and the door. His hair was dark, a shade of deep espresso cut with a casual precision that probably cost more than her monthly rent. His face was a collection of sharp, aristocratic angles, a strong jawline shadowed with dark stubble, a straight nose, and a mouth that looked as if it were carved from stone, capable of both cruelty and devastating smiles. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were the color of a gathering storm, a deep, turbulent gray, intelligent and unnervingly perceptive. They weren't angry. They were worse. They were interested. I don't understand, she finally managed, her voice a thin, reedy sound that was instantly swallowed by the opulent silence. My keycard worked. There's been a mistake. He stopped a dozen feet away. a king surveying an unexpected disturbance in his court. A faint ironic curve touched one side of his mouth. It was not a smile. It was the shadow of one, and it held no warmth. "This suite," he said, his voice a velvet rumble that vibrated through the floor and up through the soles of her shoes, "is an island. It is not connected to the hotel's reservation system, its key network, or its mistakes." He paused, his gaze sweeping over her, from her sensible, low-heeled shoes to her wide, terrified eyes. "Which means your presence here is not a mistake. It is an impossibility. And I do not like impossibilities." The implication was clear, suffocating her in a wave of fresh panic. He thought she was a corporate spy, a journalist, a woman sent to entrap him. In his world, there were no accidents, only agendas. She fumbled in her purse, her fingers clumsy and shaking, finally pulling out the plastic keycard. She held it out like a shield, a pathetic piece of plastic against his fortress of wealth. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm an architect. A landscape architect. I lost a project today. I needed a room, a quiet room. That's all." He didn't even glance at the key. His focus was entirely on her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, tracing the lines of her face, cataloguing the fear in her eyes, the flush on her cheeks. "An architect," he repeated, the words slow and deliberate, as if he were tasting them. He took another silent step closer. The scent of him, that intoxicating blend of rain, whiskey and expensive cologne, grew stronger, clouding her senses, making it even harder to think. "You're trembling," he observed, his voice still low and smooth, yet it carried a new note, a hint of something that sounded almost like satisfaction. He turned from her then, a dismissive gesture that was somehow more unnerving than his direct focus. He moved to a sleek minimalist bar carved from a single piece of dark wood. With fluid, economical movements, he took down a second crystal tumbler, the glass heavy and ornate. The sound of the heavy stopper being lifted from a decanter, the low, viscous glug of amber liquid being poured, each sound was amplified in the tense silence, a ritual of power she was being forced to witness. "You look like you could use a drink," he said, his back still to her. It was not an offer of comfort. It was a command, another move in a game she didn't understand. It was a way of prolonging her time here, of drawing her deeper into his web. "No, thank you," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "I just want to leave." He turned, holding the two glasses in one hand, his fingers long and elegant against the sparkling crystal. He walked toward her, his movements unhurried, impossibly graceful. He stopped just out of arm's reach and extended one of the glasses to her. "I wasn't asking," he said softly. The storm in his eyes dared her to refuse. Her hand shook as she took the glass. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. The contact was electric, a jolt of heat that shot up her arm, making her pulse leap. He must have felt it too, because his eyes darkened, a flicker of something hot and dangerous igniting in their depths. She took a reflexive step back, her gaze darting around the room, searching for an escape, for anything to look at besides him. And then she saw it. On the massive, polished mahogany desk near the window, laid out under a warm architectural lamp, were a series of blueprints. Rolled sheets of thick, expensive vellum held down at the corners by heavy silver paperweights. Even from this distance, she recognized the clean, minimalist drafting style, the specific way the trees were rendered, the familiar curve of the pathways. Her breath caught in a sharp, silent gasp. The air left her lungs as if she'd been punched. It wasn't just a similar style. It wasn't a coincidence. She took a stumbling step closer, the whiskey in her glass sloshing precariously. The design was for the new waterfront park, the pinnacle project that had been stolen from her, the very reason she was standing broken in this city. Her signature design elements were all there, the terraced gardens, the rainwater reclamation system, the native wildflower meadow. It was her soul laid out on paper, and at the bottom in the title block was the name of the man who had destroyed her life, her ex-mentor, her ex-fiancé. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage washed over her. The room began to spin, the glittering city lights blurring into streaks of cruel, mocking laughter. Her carefully constructed composure, her fear, her inexplicable attraction to the man before her, it all evaporated, burned away by the devastating fire of betrayal. "Is something wrong, Amber?" Joseph's voice cut through the haze, low and sharp. He had moved closer, his gaze no longer just curious but laser-focused, analytical. He had seen the shift. He had seen the recognition, the raw, visceral pain on her face as she stared at the blueprints. He had seen her mask of a frightened intruder dissolve, revealing something far more complex beneath. The random, impossible event of her arrival had just collided with the cold, hard reality of his business. He was no longer looking at a stranger. He was looking at a secret. The world, which had been spinning wildly, snapped into a tight, sharp focus on the blueprints. The glittering city lights outside the window blurred into mocking streaks of gold. The cavernous, silent suite became a pressure cooker, the air thick and hot. The whiskey glass in Amber's hand trembled, the ice cubes clinking a frantic miniature alarm against the crystal. The rage was a clean, hot fire, cauterizing the wound of her fear and incinerating the strange, fragile attraction that had begun to spark. This man, this room, this impossible situation, it was all now inextricably linked to the single greatest betrayal of her life. Amber. Joseph's voice came again, closer this time. It was no longer a velvet rumble, but the sharp, clean cut of a surgeon's scalpel, precisely targeting the source of her distress. She turned to face him, and the look in her eyes must have been terrifying, because for the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine surprise on his face. The fear was gone. The flustered, apologetic intruder had vanished. In her place stood a woman burning with a righteous fury that was incandescent. "Where did you get these?" she demanded, her voice low and shaking, not with fear, but with a rage so profound it was almost silent. She pointed a trembling finger at the desk. He didn't answer immediately. His stormy eyes shifted from her face to the blueprints and back again. The gears of his brilliant, calculating mind were turning, processing this new explosive piece of information. He had trapped a mouse only to discover it was a tigress. He closed the distance between them with a smooth, predatory grace, his gaze never leaving hers. "They are part of a proposal," he said, his voice a careful, neutral tone. "A potential acquisition for one of my new developments, the waterfront project." "A proposal from David Miller," she stated, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. Joseph's face remained impassive, but a new light entered his eyes, a sharp, analytical glint. The puzzle was beginning to take shape. "You know him?" A bitter, humorless laugh escaped her lips. "Know him? I invented him. I taught him everything he knows about sustainable design. I loved him. I was going to marry him." The confession tumbled out, raw and bleeding, filling the opulent space with the ugly, undeniable truth of her pain. She took a step toward the desk, drawn by an invisible force, her fingers hovering over the crisp vellum sheets. "This design, the rainwater reclamation system, the native meadowlands, this is my work. My final thesis project adapted. He told me the city rejected it. He told me it was a failure." She finally looked at Joseph, her eyes burning with unshed tears of fury. "He didn't just steal my work. He stole my future. And he used my own heart to do it." The silence that followed was different. It was no longer a silence of tension or seduction. It was a silence of assessment. Joseph Carter was a man who dealt in facts, in assets, in leverage. And Amber had just revealed a flaw in a multi-billion-dollar asset he was about to acquire. Her personal tragedy had just become his business liability. He walked past her to the desk, his gaze sweeping over the blueprints with a new, critical eye. He picked up a sheet, his long fingers tracing the elegant lines she knew so well. "Miller's proposal claims this entire design concept is proprietary, developed in-house by his firm over the last 2 years," he said, his voice a low, thoughtful murmur. He looked at her and the Magnate was back, but his focus was different. He was no longer trying to dominate her, he was trying to dissect her. "You're telling me that is a lie?" "It's a lie built on 100 other lies," she shot back, her voice shaking with the force of her conviction. "I have the original drafts, the conceptual sketches, the metadata on the files. I have proof." He placed the blueprint back on the desk with a soft, definitive sound. The game had changed. The power dynamic, which had been so heavily skewed in his favor, had just been fundamentally altered. She was no longer just a beautiful, intriguing anomaly. She was leverage. She was a key. She was a weapon he hadn't known he possessed. He turned to her, his expression unreadable, but the energy coming off him had shifted. It was sharper, more focused. He gestured toward one of the plush, low-slung armchairs near the fireplace. "Sit down, Amber." It was a command, but it was delivered with a new kind of gravity. She hesitated for a moment, then complied, her legs feeling suddenly weak. He didn't sit opposite her. Instead, he moved to the bar, refilling his own glass and, without asking, topping off hers. He brought the drink to her, crouching down in front of her chair so their eyes were on the same level. The move was disarming, shockingly intimate. He was a king kneeling before a pawn, a gesture that was both a sign of respect and a subtle act of manipulation. "Miller is set to sign the final contracts on this project in 48 hours, he said, his voice a low conspiratorial murmur that drew her in. "It's one of the largest urban renewal projects in the country. My name, my capital is behind it." He paused, his gaze intense, unwavering. "If what you're saying is true, if the entire foundation of this project is built on fraud, it would be inconvenient." She looked into his stormy eyes and saw the truth. It wouldn't just be inconvenient, it would be a disaster. A public humiliation for a man who lived his life in the shadows. A financial catastrophe that would ripple through his empire. She had, in her clumsy, accidental intrusion, stumbled upon the one secret that could hurt him. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered the most exquisite prey. "So it seems we have a mutual problem," he whispered. His fingers brushed the back of her hand, which was resting on the arm of the chair. The touch was light, but it was not a comforting gesture. It was a brand, a claim, and a mutual enemy. He leaned closer, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it, a sound that was both a caress and a command. "You want your life back, and I do not tolerate being made a fool of." He held her gaze, the world shrinking to the space between them. "Stay," he murmured, the single word a silken chain wrapping around her. "Stay here in this suite. Tell me everything. Show me your proof." He paused, letting the offer hang in the air, a temptation she couldn't possibly refuse. "And in return," he whispered, his thumb brushing slowly, deliberately over her racing pulse, "I will give you the one thing you want more than anything else. Revenge." The word revenge hung in the air, a dark and glittering jewel. It was a word Amber hadn't dared to let herself think, let alone speak. She had thought in terms of survival, of escape, of finding a quiet corner of the world where the ache of betrayal might eventually dull. But revenge? The concept was as foreign and intoxicating as the man kneeling before her. It was a language of power, a currency of a world she had never inhabited, and he was offering it to her as casually as he had offered her a drink. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, chaotic rhythm of fear and a terrible, exhilarating hope. He was offering her a deal with the devil, a devil dressed in cashmere and armed with a smile that could shatter kingdoms. Every rational instinct she possessed screamed at her to refuse, to run from this man and the dangerous, all-consuming fire in his eyes. He wasn't offering to help her out of kindness. He was a magnate, a shark who smelled blood in the water, the blood of her ex-fiancé, a man who had dared to defraud him. She was simply a convenient, beautifully packaged weapon. She looked from his hand, still resting on hers, to the stormy depths of his eyes. She saw the calculation there, the cold, strategic mind of a master player assessing his new position on the board. But she saw something else too, a flicker of that same raw, personal intensity she had seen when he kissed her. This wasn't just business for him. David Miller hadn't just committed fraud. He had, in Joseph's eyes, attempted to tarnish his world, and that was a personal affront. And she, Amber, was the living, breathing proof of that insult. "Why?" she whispered, her voice husky. "Why would you do this for me?" He didn't answer immediately. His thumb continued its slow, deliberate stroking over her pulse, a mesmerizing, hypnotic gesture that made it hard to think. "Let's be clear," he said, his voice a low, smooth murmur that was both honest and manipulative. "I am not doing this for you. I am doing this for me. I have a reputation for being thorough. David Miller attempted to sell me a fraudulent asset. He assumed I wouldn't look closely enough. He assumed I was just another faceless source of capital." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound that was both a confession and a threat. "I find that assumption distasteful. Miller needs to be taught a lesson in due diligence. You are simply the instrument of that lesson." It was a cold, brutal assessment, and yet it was the most reassuring thing he could have said. He wasn't pretending to be a white knight. He was admitting his own selfish motives, laying his cards on the table. In a strange, twisted way, it was a form of honesty she could trust far more than any empty promise of altruism. "And what do you get out of it?" she pressed, finding a sliver of her old analytical self. A slow, devastating smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator who knows the trap has been sprung. "Aside from the professional satisfaction of eviscerating a man who tried to cheat me," he murmured. "I get you." The words were a direct hit, stealing the breath from her lungs. "I'm not part of the deal," she said, her voice shaking despite her best efforts. "Aren't you?" He countered softly, his gaze dropping to her lips. "You are the key to this entire situation. The proof, the motive, the narrative. For the next 48 hours, you are the most valuable asset I possess." His eyes lifted back to hers, dark and intense. "I intend to protect my assets." The possessiveness in his voice should have terrified her. It did. But it also sent a thrilling, shameful shiver of excitement through her. After months of feeling discarded, worthless and invisible, this man, this powerful, dangerous man, was looking at her as if she were the most valuable thing in the world. She pulled her hand from under his, a small symbolic act of defiance. "I'm not an asset, Mr. Carter. I'm a person. If I do this, if I give you my proof, it's on my terms." He didn't flinch. He simply rose to his feet in one fluid motion, looking down at her, the full force of his height and power once again on display. He had allowed her a moment of equality, and now he was reminding her who was truly in control. "Then let's hear them," he said, his voice once again cool and commanding. "What are your terms?" She stood up, needing to be on his level, needing to reclaim some of the ground she had just surrendered. "First," she said, her voice gaining strength, "this is about justice, not just revenge. I want my name credited as the sole designer of the waterfront project. I want a public apology from David, and I want him ruined professionally, not just inconvenienced." Joseph's expression remained unreadable. He walked to the window, staring out at the city that was his kingdom. "Those are not terms. Those are results. All of them are acceptable and achievable." He turned to face her, his silhouette a dark, powerful shape against the glittering skyline. "What else?" She took a deep breath. "This was the dangerous part. And while I am here, while I am your asset, this—" She gestured to the space between them, the space that still crackled with the memory of their kiss. "This doesn't happen again. This is a professional arrangement." A long, heavy silence stretched between them. He studied her, his stormy eyes narrowed, his face an inscrutable mask. She could feel her resolve beginning to waver under the intensity of his gaze. She had just drawn a line in the sand, and she was terrified he would simply step over it. Finally, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "A professional arrangement," he repeated, the words tasting like a lie on his tongue. He walked toward her, stopping just inches away, so close she could feel the heat of his body, smell the intoxicating scent of his skin. He didn't touch her, but he didn't have to. His proximity was a caress, a brand. He leaned in, his lips hovering just beside her ear, his voice a low, velvet whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "As you wish, Miss Olsen." He paused, his breath warm against her skin. "But you and I both know," he murmured, "that the most interesting arrangements are the ones where the terms are broken." The ghost of his whisper lingered against her skin long after he had straightened up. "The most interesting arrangements are the ones where the terms are broken." It was a threat, a promise and a seduction all wrapped in a single devastating sentence. Amber's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She had drawn her line, and he had agreed to it. But he had also made it perfectly clear that he considered the line an invitation, not a barrier. The air in the suite was thick with a new kind of tension, the charged, electric hum of a temporary truce in a war that was far from over. He stepped back, granting her a small, precious pocket of air to breathe. The Magnate was back in control, the brief flicker of raw desire carefully banked and hidden behind his cool, stormy eyes. "My team will be here in 1 hour," he said, his voice once again crisp and professional. "Lawyers, forensic accountants, they will need to debrief you, to see every piece of evidence you have. Your original drafts, your email correspondence, everything." The mention of his team, of the outside world invading this strange, isolated bubble, was a jarring splash of cold water. This was real. This wasn't just a game of seduction in a penthouse suite. It was the beginning of a corporate battle, and she was the star witness. A wave of nervous energy surged through her. "My evidence. It's on my laptop. In my room. I'll have it brought up," he said, already moving toward the phone on his desk. He spoke into it with a low, quiet authority, his instructions precise and absolute. He never raised his voice, but the effect was one of total command. The person on the other end would not dare to fail. While he was on the phone, Amber felt a desperate need to reclaim some semblance of herself. She was not just a witness, not just an asset. She was a woman who had been ambushed by the most surreal 48 hours of her life. She walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, wrapping her arms around herself as she stared out at the sprawling, indifferent city below. From this height, the world was a map, a collection of lights and lines. It was a god's-eye view, his view. She could feel the dizzying pull of it, the seductive allure of seeing the world as he did, as something to be controlled, to be owned. "It's a different perspective, isn't it?" His voice came from just behind her. He had moved with that same unnerving, silent grace. She hadn't even heard him approach. She didn't turn. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon. "It makes everything look small," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's the point," he murmured, his voice a low rumble near her ear. She could feel the heat of his body, the subtle scent of his cologne. He was honoring their professional boundary by not touching her, but he was using his proximity as a weapon, a constant simmering reminder of the fire that burned between them. "When everything looks small," he continued, "it's easier to see the whole board, the patterns, the weaknesses, and the assets," she added, her voice sharp with a hint of her earlier defiance. She felt more than heard his low chuckle. "And the assets," he agreed. "Especially the unexpected ones." A moment later, a discreet knock echoed at the suite door. One of his staff, a man in a perfectly tailored suit with a face devoid of expression, entered carrying her laptop and her single, scuffed travel bag. He placed them on a nearby table with a quiet reverence, as if they were royal artifacts, and then disappeared as silently as he had arrived. The efficiency was seamless, terrifying. Seeing her meager belongings sitting in the middle of this opulent suite was a fresh wave of humiliation. The worn bag, the laptop covered in stickers from coffee shops, they were symbols of her small, ordinary life, looking pathetic and out of place in his world. As if sensing her thoughts, Joseph moved to the bar. "You look like you need that drink now," he said, pouring another measure of the amber whiskey into a clean glass. He brought it to her, his fingers deliberately not touching hers as he handed it to her. It was a small mocking acknowledgement of her terms. She took a sip, the fiery liquid a welcome burn in her throat, steadying her nerves. "I'm not used to this," she said, gesturing vaguely at the room, at the silent efficiency at him. "This level of everything." "You will be," he said. It wasn't a reassurance. It was a statement of fact. A prophecy. The hour passed in a state of suspended animation. They didn't speak of David or of the kiss. Instead, he asked her questions about her life, her work, her childhood. The questions were probing, personal, yet he asked them with a detached curiosity, like a scientist studying a fascinating new specimen. He was gathering data, learning her weaknesses, her strengths. And she, in turn, found herself answering, revealing small pieces of herself she hadn't intended to. She was so used to being invisible, so starved for the simple act of being seen, that his focused, intelligent attention was a drug she couldn't refuse. When the team arrived, the shift in atmosphere was immediate. The intimate, charged bubble they had occupied was shattered by the arrival of 3 people who moved and spoke with the same quiet, lethal efficiency as their boss. There were 2 men and 1 woman, all dressed in severe, expensive suits, their faces sharp and intelligent. They introduced themselves, but their names were a blur. They were his instruments, extensions of his will. They set up in the main living area, transforming the luxurious space into a high-tech war room. Laptops were opened, projectors were activated, and documents were spread across the vast coffee table. Amber felt a fresh wave of intimidation. This was real. She was at the center of a corporate hurricane. Joseph led her to the table. "Amber, this is my legal counsel," he said, his voice all business. Tell them everything. Don't leave out a single detail. He didn't sit with them. He retreated to his desk by the window, a silent, watchful king observing the proceedings. But his presence was a constant weight in the room, his focus entirely on her. As the lead lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair, began her questioning, Amber felt a tremor of her old fear return. She was out of her depth, a small boat in a vast, stormy ocean. She took a deep breath, her gaze flickering across the room to meet his. He gave her a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the reassurance she needed. It was a silent message: I am here. I am watching. You are not alone. And as she began to speak, to lay out the story of David's betrayal, to detail the theft of her work, her voice did not tremble. It was clear, steady, and strong. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman with a story to tell, and for the first time she had an audience who would not only listen but act. She was his asset, yes, but she was also his weapon, and she was ready to be aimed. For the next 3 hours, Amber was the center of their universe. The world of silent observation and emotional turmoil was replaced by a sharp, clinical reality. The lawyers were relentless, their questions precise and exhaustive. They deconstructed her life, her relationship with David, and her career with a dispassionate surgical skill. They asked for dates, for times, for the names of witnesses to conversations. They were building a case, brick by painful brick, and she was the quarry from which they mined every stone. At first it was excruciating, reliving the slow, creeping horror of David's betrayal, the gaslighting, the dismissal of her work, the final devastating discard. It was like picking at a wound that had not yet begun to heal. Her voice wavered as she recounted the intimate, specific details of how he had woven his lies into the fabric of their love. She spoke of late nights in their shared studio, where she had poured her soul onto vellum, explaining her concepts while he watched, his expression a mask of admiration that she now understood was pure, predatory assessment. Through it all, she was intensely aware of Joseph. He remained at his desk, a silent, imposing figure against the glittering backdrop of the city. He appeared to be working, his attention on the screen of his own laptop, but she knew he was listening to every word. Occasionally, she would risk a glance in his direction, and she would find his stormy eyes on her, his expression unreadable, but his focus absolute. His presence was a strange and contradictory comfort. He was the reason she was enduring this interrogation, yet he was also the anchor that kept her from being swept away by the painful currents of the past. The lead lawyer, a formidable woman named Evelyn Reed, was particularly sharp. She had a way of asking a question that seemed simple on the surface, but was designed to expose the core of an issue. "Ms. Olson," she said, her voice a calm, even tone that belied the intensity of her focus, "you said Mr. Miller called your design academically interesting, but commercially unviable. Did you ever challenge that assessment?" Amber's hands clenched in her lap. "At first, yes," I argued with him. I showed him the viability studies I had done. But he was very convincing. He said he was protecting me from disappointment, that the corporate world would chew me up. He made me feel naive. He made me feel small. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Joseph's hands still on his keyboard. A muscle in his jaw tightened. As the hours wore on, something shifted within Amber. The shame and humiliation began to recede, replaced by a cold, clarifying anger. Recounting the facts, laying them out for this team of legal sharks, stripped the story of its emotional power over her and turned it into a weapon. She opened her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a newfound confidence. She pulled up the original design files, the metadata clearly showing creation dates that were years older than David's proposal. She showed them email chains where she had explained complex engineering principles to him, and his replies, which were full of praise but demonstrated a fundamental lack of understanding. She was no longer just telling a story of a broken heart. She was presenting a case of intellectual property theft, clear and irrefutable. The lawyer's expressions, initially neutral and professional, began to change. They exchanged sharp, knowing glances. Evelyn Reed leaned forward, a glint of predatory excitement in her eyes. "This is excellent, Miss Olson. This is more than we had hoped for. The metadata is a digital fingerprint he can't wipe away." By the time they finished, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in fiery streaks of orange and purple. The legal team packed up their equipment with the same quiet efficiency with which they had arrived. The war room was once again a luxurious living room. As they filed out, Evelyn Reed paused before Amber. "You've been through a great deal, Ms. Olson," she said, her voice softer now, a hint of genuine respect in her tone. "You have our full resources at your disposal. Mr. Carter will see to that." Then they were gone. The silence that descended on the suite was profound. It was just the two of them again, left in the aftermath of the storm. Amber felt utterly drained, emotionally hollowed out. She remained seated on the sofa, staring at the empty coffee table, the ghosts of her past finally exorcised and laid bare. Joseph rose from his desk and walked toward her. He moved to the bar and poured 2 glasses of whiskey, the clink of the ice the only sound in the room. He handed one to her, his fingers brushing hers, a touch that was no longer a test but a quiet acknowledgement of the ordeal she had just endured. She took a long sip, the fiery liquid a welcome balm. He didn't sit opposite her. He sat beside her on the sofa, not close enough to break her terms, but close enough that his presence was a solid, comforting weight. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply watched as the city lights began to flicker on, a new constellation being born in the twilight. "You were impressive," he said finally, his voice a low, rough murmur. She looked at him, surprised. It was not the compliment she had expected. "I was a mess," she countered, a tremor in her voice. "No," he said, turning to face her, his gaze direct and unwavering. "You were a fighter. You took the worst thing that ever happened to you, and you turned it into evidence. You weaponized your pain." He paused, his expression growing serious. "Most people break. You didn't. You bent, but you didn't break." His words were a validation she hadn't known she needed. He wasn't offering her pity. He was offering her respect. It was a gift more precious than anything his money could buy. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling so foreign and so welcome it almost made her weep. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Now," he said, his eyes darkening with a familiar, dangerous intensity, "we let the sharks hunt. And while they do," he leaned a fraction closer, the professional arrangement forgotten for a moment, the air between them once again thick with unspoken promises, "you stay here. With me, where I can protect my asset." The word asset should have felt cold and transactional, a stark reminder of her role in his high-stakes game. But the way he said it, his voice a low, possessive rumble, laced with a protectiveness that was as fierce as it was unexpected, made it sound like the most precious word in the world. Amber's heart gave a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. She was living in a state of constant contradiction, her mind warning her of the danger while her body, her very soul, seemed to be leaning irrevocably toward him. "I have a room," she said, the protest sounding weak even to her own ears. It was a feeble attempt to cling to the last vestiges of her independence, to the drab, anonymous space that was supposed to be her sanctuary. A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. "I have a box with a window that looks at a brick wall," he countered, his voice gentle, but laced with an unyielding authority. "This is not about comfort, Amber. This is about control. David Miller doesn't know you're here yet. He doesn't know that the foundation of his empire is about to crumble. When he finds out, he will be unpredictable, desperate. I will not have you in a flimsy room on the 7th floor where anyone can reach you." His logic was flawless, infuriatingly so. He had framed it as a security issue, a tactical necessity. But they both knew it was more than that. It was a claim. He was moving her from the periphery of his world to its very center, placing her in his fortress, where he could watch over her. The thought was both terrifying and deeply, shamefully thrilling. After months of feeling like she was drifting, untethered, he was offering her an anchor, albeit a dangerous and gilded one. "My things," she murmured, already knowing it was a lost battle, "are already here," he said, gesturing with his head toward the far side of the suite. For the first time, she noticed a set of double doors she hadn't seen before. "I had your bag moved to the guest suite." "It's adequate." Adequate. She could only imagine what a billionaire's version of adequate looked like. The silent, seamless efficiency of his power was on full display again, a constant reminder of the world she was stepping into. He had anticipated her surrender before she had even conceded. She rose from the sofa, the empty whiskey glass feeling heavy in her hand. The emotional exhaustion of the last few hours had settled deep into her bones. She needed a moment to breathe, to process the seismic shift that had just occurred. She had arrived at this hotel a refugee, and now she was a protected asset, a pampered prisoner in a penthouse suite. "I think I need a minute," she said, her voice quiet. "Take all the time you need," he replied, his gaze following her as she walked toward the double doors. She pushed them open and stepped inside. The word adequate was a laughable understatement. The guest suite was larger than her entire old apartment. It was a sanctuary of muted creams and soft greys, with a massive bed draped in what looked like 1,000 thread-count linens, a private sitting area with its own fireplace, and an ensuite bathroom that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of white marble. Her single scuffed bag sat at the foot of the bed, looking utterly pathetic in the midst of such opulence. She walked into the bathroom, the cool marble floor a shock beneath her tired feet. She stared at her reflection in the vast backlit mirror. The woman looking back at her was a stranger. Her eyes were wide, her pupils dark with a mixture of fear and excitement. Her lips were slightly swollen, a phantom reminder of his kiss. A flush of color stained her cheeks. She looked alive, more alive than she had felt in years. She turned on the ornate silver tap, splashing cold water on her face. The sensation was grounding, a brief respite from the dizzying, intoxicating reality of her situation. She was playing with fire. A man like Joseph Carter didn't just enter your life. He consumed it. He had offered her revenge, but she knew with a terrifying certainty that the price would be steep. He was a man who did not believe in gifts, only in transactions. And she was beginning to suspect that the asset he was most interested in protecting wasn't her evidence. It was her. She dried her face with a towel that was impossibly soft and took a deep, steadying breath. Her terms. A professional arrangement. The words felt like a joke now, a flimsy shield she had tried to hold up against a tidal wave. She had drawn a line, and while he hadn't physically crossed it again, he had redrawn the entire map, moving the line and her into his territory. When she returned to the main room, the atmosphere had changed. The lights had been dimmed, casting the space in a soft, intimate glow. The faint, melodic notes of a piano drifted from a hidden sound system, a melancholy, classical piece that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. He was standing by the window again, a dark silhouette against the sea of city lights. He turned as she approached, his stormy eyes searching her face. "Better?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She nodded, unable to speak. The intimacy of the scene, the soft music, the dim lights, the two of them alone high above the world, was overwhelming. It felt less like a war room and more like a seduction. "Good," he said. He gestured toward the dining table, which had been discreetly cleared and reset while she was gone. A bottle of wine was breathing in a crystal decanter, and 2 places were set. "The sharks are hunting. Now the asset needs to eat." He pulled out a chair for her, a gesture of old-world courtesy that was utterly at odds with the ruthless magnate she knew him to be. The contradiction was dizzying, deliberate. He was showing her all the different facets of his power, the cold tactician, the tender protector, the sophisticated gentleman. He was keeping her off balance, ensuring she never knew which version of him she was dealing with. As she sat down, her mind raced. He had agreed to her terms, but the night was young. And in this beautiful, dangerous cage, surrounded by the soft, seductive melody of the piano, she knew her professional arrangement was about to face its most difficult test yet. Dinner was a masterclass in subtle seduction. The food, which appeared as if by magic, delivered by a silent server who materialized and vanished like a ghost, was exquisite. Each course was a delicate, complex work of art, paired with a wine so perfect it seemed to sing on her tongue. But the meal itself was secondary. It was a prop, a beautiful, elaborate stage for the real event. Him. He was a different man than the one she had met for dinner the night before in the noisy, functional restaurant downstairs. The polite, almost gentle guest was gone. In his place was the lord of the manor, completely at ease in his domain, his power a quiet, confident hum that filled the space. He didn't need to be ruthless or commanding. His very presence was a declaration of his control. And his focus, his entire undivided attention was on her. He kept the conversation light, a deliberate move to disarm her. He steered clear of David, of the legal battle to come, of the charged emotional territory they had waded into just hours before. Instead, he drew her out, asking about her passions, the things that lit up her eyes when she spoke. He asked about the garden she dreamed of designing, the ones that existed only in the pages of her sketchbooks. She found herself talking, the words flowing more easily than she expected, fueled by the excellent wine and the intensity of his interest. She spoke of creating ecosystems in the heart of the city, of using native plants to build sustainable sanctuaries, of her belief that a well-designed space could heal a wounded spirit. He listened, his chin propped on his hand, his stormy eyes never leaving her face. He didn't just listen to her words. He seemed to hear the passion beneath them, the quiet artistic soul she kept hidden from the world. "You're not an architect," he said, when she paused to take a sip of wine. "You're a poet who works with soil and light." The observation was so astute, so deeply perceptive, that it struck her silent. David had always called her passion a quaint hobby. He had praised her technical skill, but had never once acknowledged the artistry, the soul that she poured into her work. For Joseph, a man who dealt in steel and glass and concrete empires, to see the poetry in her work was a form of intimacy that was more profound than any kiss. A warm, treacherous flush crept up her neck. "And what about you?" she countered, needing to turn the focus away from herself before she revealed too much. "What does the man who builds the tallest towers in the world do when he's not acquiring things?" A shadow passed over his features, a flicker of something dark and guarded. "I don't do anything," he said, his voice flat. "I work, I build. The rest is noise." It was the first crack she had seen in his perfect polished armor since he had confessed his loneliness. He was a man who lived entirely in his head, in the world of strategy and control. He didn't have hobbies. He had objectives. The quiet sadness in his admission made her ache. "Everyone needs a little noise," she said softly. His eyes met hers across the table, and the polite, charming dinner guest vanished, replaced by the intense, predatory man from before. The air grew thick again, charged with the unspoken things that had been simmering beneath the surface of their conversation. "I'm beginning to realize that," he murmured, his voice a low velvet rumble that sent shivers down her spine. After dinner, he didn't suggest they move to the living area. Instead, he stood and walked to the massive wall of glass, looking out at the glittering, endless city. He was silent for a long moment, a solitary, powerful figure against the backdrop of his kingdom. "Come here," he said, his voice quiet, but carrying the unmistakable weight of a command. She hesitated. Her professional arrangement. The line she had drawn. Every rational part of her brain was flashing red warning lights, but her body was already moving, drawn by the irresistible gravity of his presence. She walked to stand beside him, not too close, leaving a careful foot of space between them. The city lights were a breathtaking, dizzying spectacle from this height. "I bought my first building when I was 22, he said, his voice a low, reflective murmur. "A derelict warehouse down by the old docks. Everyone said I was a fool. I renovated it myself with a small crew. Lived on instant noodles and ambition for a year." He paused. "I sold it for 10 times what I paid. That's where it all started." She listened, captivated. It was the first piece of his personal history he had offered, a glimpse behind the impenetrable walls of the Magnate. "I stood on the roof of that warehouse the night the sale went through," he continued, his gaze lost in the sea of lights, "and I felt nothing. Just the need to find the next one, the bigger one." He finally turned his head, his stormy eyes finding hers in the dim light. "I've been standing on that same roof ever since, just getting higher and higher, waiting to feel something." The raw, unguarded confession hung in the air between them. He was a king who had conquered the world only to find his throne was empty. "And now," she whispered, her heart aching for the lonely boy on that roof. He lifted his hand, his fingers hovering in the space between them for a heartbeat before they came to rest on her cheek. His touch was electric, a jolt of heat that made her breath catch. It was a clear, deliberate breach of her terms, and she did nothing to stop it. "And now," he whispered, his thumb brushing slowly, sensuously over her cheekbone, "You walked into the wrong room." His eyes dropped to her lips, the storm within them gathering force. "Or maybe," he murmured, leaning closer, erasing the last of the space between them, "for the first time in my life." The right one. The touch was a spark in a room filled with gasoline. The air ignited. Amber's carefully constructed defenses, her professional arrangement, her rational fears, they all turned to ash in the fire of that single searing touch. She didn't pull away. She couldn't. Her body, a traitor to her mind, leaned into his palm, a silent, desperate confession of her own longing. His skin was warm, his touch both impossibly gentle and possessively firm. It was a touch that said, "You are mine." His words echoed in the charged silence, a confession that stripped away the last of her resistance. The right one. He wasn't just talking about a room. He was talking about a life spent on a lonely rooftop, waiting for a feeling that had never arrived. Until now. Until her. The sheer, terrifying weight of that admission made her entire body tremble. His gaze was a physical force holding her captive. The storm in his eyes was no longer distant. It was here, breaking directly over her. He searched her face, not with the analytical curiosity of before, but with a raw, gut-wrenching vulnerability, as if he were looking for an answer to a question he didn't know how to ask. Her lips parted, a silent invitation, a surrender she was no longer trying to fight. The world seemed to slow down, the city lights outside blurring into a soft, hazy glow. The melancholy piano music, drifting from the speakers, was the only sound, a sad, beautiful soundtrack to their inevitable fall. He leaned in, his movements agonizingly slow, giving her every opportunity to retreat. It was a test, a final offer of an escape she both craved and dreaded. But her feet were rooted to the floor. Her universe had collapsed to this single point in space, to the heat of his palm against her cheek, to the scent of him filling her senses, to the promise of his mouth just a breath away from hers. When his lips finally met hers, it was with a profound, earth-shattering tenderness. It was not the consuming fire of their first kiss, nor the desperate claiming of their second. This was different. This was a kiss of reverence. It was a kiss that spoke of discovery, of disbelief, of a man finding a miracle he had long since stopped searching for. It was soft, searching, and it undid her completely. A soft sound, a sigh of pure, unadulterated surrender, escaped her lips and was captured by his. His arm slid around her waist, pulling her flush against the hard lines of his body. The last of the space between them vanished. She was no longer a separate entity, but an extension of him, molded to his form as if she had been created for this very purpose. Her hands, which had been hanging uselessly at her sides, came up to rest on his chest. She could feel the steady, powerful thud of his heart beneath her palms, a rhythm that was somehow both calmer and more alive than her own. He deepened the kiss, the initial tenderness giving way to a slow-burning, desperate hunger. It was a hunger for connection, for feeling, for the noise she represented in his silent world. He was a starving man and she was a feast. Her mind went blank, all thoughts erased by the overwhelming flood of sensation. The taste of him, a complex blend of expensive wine and his own unique masculine flavor. The solid, unyielding strength of his body, holding her as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. The whisper of his breath against her skin as he trailed a line of soft, open-mouthed kisses from her lips to the sensitive curve of her jaw. "Amber," he murmured against her skin, her name a prayer, a plea. She tilted her head back, granting him access to the tender column of her throat, her fingers tangling in the thick, soft cashmere of his sweater. She was drowning, and she had never felt so alive. The professional arrangement, the lines drawn in the sand, the fear of his world, it all seemed like a distant, foolish memory from another lifetime. There was only this man, this moment, this undeniable, all-consuming connection that was rewriting the rules of her entire existence. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. His eyes were dark, his pupils dilated with a desire that was so raw, so potent. It was a physical force. But beneath the hunger, there was something else. A question. He was giving her one last chance, my terms, she whispered, the words a ghost of her former resolve. A slow, devastatingly sad smile touched his lips. "I know," he said, his voice a rough, broken sound. He started to pull away, to honor the boundary she had so foolishly tried to create. He was a man of his word, even when it cost him everything. But the thought of him retreating, of the space returning between them, of the silence descending once more, was unbearable. In that split second she made a choice, not with her mind but with her soul. Her hands slid from his chest up around his neck, pulling him back to her. "To hell with my terms," she whispered against his lips, and then she was the one who kissed him. A kiss of pure, unadulterated decision. A kiss that sealed her fate and welcomed the fire that was destined to consume them both. The moment the words left her lips, the last thread of his formidable control snapped. A low, guttural groan tore from his chest, the sound of a man who had been holding back a tidal wave and had just surrendered to the flood. His arms became steel bands around her, crushing her against him, as if he could absorb her into himself, fusing them together so she could never be separated from him again. The kiss was no longer tender. It was a desperate, frantic claiming. It was the kiss of a man who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom he never thought he'd rule. The kiss of a drowning man finally finding air. There was no thought, no hesitation. There was only a raw, primal instinct that had taken over them both. His mouth was everywhere, on her lips, her jaw, the sensitive hollow of her throat. Each kiss was a brand, a mark of possession, a vow spoken in the language of pure, unrestrained desire. Amber met his ferocity with her own, her fingers digging into the hard muscle of his shoulders, her body arching into his. The months of heartache, of feeling invisible and discarded, had created a well of untapped passion within her, and he had just shattered the dam. He lifted her with an ease that stole her breath, his mouth never leaving hers. Her legs wrapped around his waist instinctively, and he carried her from the window, his long, powerful strides purposeful and sure. The world was a blur of muted colors and soft light, the melancholy piano music a distant, poignant soundtrack to their surrender. She didn't know where he was taking her. She didn't care. As long as she was in his arms, the rest of the world ceased to exist. He laid her down on the impossibly soft sheets of the massive bed in the guest suite, her suite. For a moment he loomed over her, a dark, powerful silhouette against the dim light. His chest was rising and falling in ragged breaths, his stormy eyes burning with a fire so intense it seemed to scorch her very soul. He was looking at her as if she were the culmination of every secret desire he'd ever had, the answer to a prayer he'd never dared to speak. "Amber," he breathed, his voice a rough, broken thing. He reached out, his hand shaking almost imperceptibly as he brushed a strand of hair from her forehead. The gesture was so tender, so at odds with the consuming hunger in his eyes that it made her heart ache. "Don't say anything," she whispered, her voice trembling. She couldn't bear to hear words of caution, of regret. She couldn't bear to let the real world intrude, not yet. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp, tense line of his jaw. "Don't think, just feel." That was all the invitation he needed. He came down to her, not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate weight that was both a comfort and a claiming. His body covered hers, a warm, living blanket of muscle and heat. He supported himself on his elbows, his gaze still locked on hers, and he began to kiss her again with an agonizing, exquisite slowness. He kissed her as if he had all the time in the world, as if he intended to learn every secret her lips held. His hands began a slow, reverent exploration, mapping the curves of her body through the simple black dress. His touch was electric, igniting a trail of fire everywhere he went. He traced the line of her collarbone, the curve of her waist, the swell of her hip. It was not the clumsy fumbling of an inexperienced lover. It was the confident, artful touch of a master, discovering a priceless work of art. He was unwrapping her, not just her clothes, but her very soul, layer by painful, beautiful layer. A soft, desperate sound escaped her throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated pleasure. The sound seemed to fuel him, his movements becoming more urgent, his kisses deeper, more demanding. The soft cashmere of his sweater was an impossibly soft friction against her skin. The scent of him, clean, masculine, and utterly intoxicating, filled her senses, drowning out everything else. The world narrowed to a pinprick of pure sensation, the heat of his skin, the rasp of his stubble, the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beating in time with her own. The lonely magnate and the invisible archivist disappeared. In their place were just a man and a woman, stripped bare of their titles, their pasts, their fears. There was only the raw, undeniable truth of their connection, a force of nature that had been building since the moment her key had slid into the wrong door. When his lips trailed from her mouth to the sensitive skin of her neck, her head fell back against the pillows in a gesture of complete and total surrender. Her fingers tangled in his hair, holding him there, silently begging him not to stop. The city lights outside glittered like a million distant, unblinking eyes, silent witnesses to the moment. She gave up the ghost of the woman she had been and embraced the fire of the woman he was making her become. This was not a mistake. It was not a complication. It was an inevitability. It was destiny, in all its terrifying, beautiful, and consuming glory. The night was a fever dream, a beautiful, chaotic storm of tangled limbs and whispered confessions. In the heart of his silent, sterile empire, Amber was a whirlwind of life, of sensation, of sound. The soft gasps that escaped her lips, the way she cried out his name in the darkness. It was the noise he had craved, a symphony that shattered the crushing solitude of his existence. He, in turn, worshipped her with a reverence that bordered on desperation. Every touch, every kiss, every movement was a testament to a hunger that had been dormant for a decade. He was a man rediscovering a forgotten language, and she was his entire vocabulary. There was no sense of time. The glittering city outside could have burned to the ground for all they knew. Their world had shrunk to the confines of the massive bed, to the landscape of each other's bodies. He learned the delicate arch of her foot, the sensitive skin behind her knee, the way a shiver would trace its way up her spine when he whispered against her ear. She learned the solid, comforting weight of his body over hers, the surprising softness of his hair, the way a muscle in his jaw would clench just before he lost control. They were two archaeologists, excavating the long-buried secrets of each other's souls through the language of touch. For Amber, it was a profound, earth-shattering reclamation. After a relationship that had ended with her feeling small, used, and invisible, Joseph made her feel like the center of the universe. He didn't just desire her. He saw her. In the darkness, when the masks of the Magnate and the archivist were gone, he would trace the lines of her face with his fingertips as if he were memorizing a map. "Tell me something no one else knows," he would murmur, his voice a low, rough sound against her hair, and she would. She would tell him about her childhood dream of designing a garden on the moon, about her secret fear of heights, about the one time she had cried over a perfectly preserved, centuries-old manuscript. He absorbed her stories, her secrets, her fears, holding them as if they were precious artifacts. In return, he offered her fragments of himself. He spoke of a childhood spent in lonely boarding schools, of a father who measured love in stock prices, of a relentless, burning ambition that had been both his greatest gift and his most profound curse. He confessed that the night she'd appeared in his suite, he had been just hours away from signing a deal that would have made him the sole owner of the very hotel they were in, a final empty conquest in a long line of them. "I build things, Amber," he had whispered, his voice raw in the darkness, "because I don't know how to connect with people. But you are not a building. You are a garden. You are alive." As dawn approached, painting the sky in soft, bruised shades of lavender and rose, a fragile peace settled over them. Amber lay curled against his side, her head resting on his chest, her ear pressed against the slow, steady rhythm of his heart. His arm was a heavy, comforting weight around her, his fingers idly tracing patterns on her back. The storm had passed, leaving in its wake a deep, quiet intimacy that was more powerful than the fiercest passion. She had never felt so safe, so utterly cherished. She lifted her head, her gaze tracing the strong, sharp line of his jaw in the pale morning light. He was awake, his stormy eyes watching her, the usual guards down, replaced by a soft, unguarded tenderness. He looked peaceful. It was a look she suspected very few people in the world had ever been allowed to see. "Good morning," she whispered, her voice husky with sleep. A slow, lazy smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that made her heart ache with its simple beauty. "Is it?" he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He reached up, his thumb brushing gently over her slightly swollen lips. "I confess I lost track of time." "Me too," she admitted, a warm flush rising on her cheeks. They lay in a comfortable silence for a long moment, simply watching each other, the unspoken emotions passing between them in the quiet, golden light. The professional arrangement, the terms, the lines drawn in the sand, it was all a distant, ridiculous memory. "There was no going back from this, so," she began, her voice soft but laced with a new, unfamiliar confidence. "What happens now, Mr. Carter?" She used his formal name as a gentle tease, a playful acknowledgement of the journey they had taken from their first, tense confrontation. His smile widened. He leaned in and captured her lips in a slow, deep, and devastatingly tender kiss. It was a kiss that held the memory of the night and the promise of the morning. It was a kiss that sealed their new reality. When he pulled back, his eyes were serious, the storm within them gathering not with conflict, but with a powerful, unwavering purpose. "Now," he said, his voice a firm, quiet vow, "we get your life back, and then you and I are going to have a very long, very interesting conversation about the future." He paused, his hand coming to rest possessively on her hip. "Because my world has been quiet for far too long. And I've decided I like the noise you make." He promised her justice, but his world is filled with rivals and secrets. Can a love born from a mistake survive the battle to come? Or will the Magnate's dangerous world consume them both? For more stories of slow-burn seduction and billionaires who play for keeps, hit subscribe and stay until the very end. Tell me in the comments, would you trust a man like Joseph Carter, or would you dare to be the one to break his solitude?